Good morning, I'm David Chappell. Welcome to this talk on Azure and its competitors, the big picture. Please, please focus on that subtitle. Because if you're here looking for like feature comparisons between Azure and Amazon, nope, I'm not going to do those things. We're going to talk instead about, well, the big picture. And I'll tell you what that means. So let's start. Let's start by thinking about a question that you may have not thought about before. The question is this: what were the three most important events in enterprise IT, the world we work in, yes, in the last decade or last dozen years? What were the three most important events, enterprise IT, in the last dozen years or so? Well, I think people might disagree, yes? But here are my choices. Here are my choices for the three most important events, enterprise IT, in the last dozen years, and I will tell you, once I've described them, why these are my choices. First, the IPO, the initial public offering of Salesforce back in 2004. That was so important because it showed all of us that this idea of software as a service, SaaS, actually works as a technology and as a business. That IPO got some attention, okay? Had some visibility. The second most important event, I would suggest, was almost invisible. Almost nobody saw it. It was the release, the launch of Amazon Web Services 2006. Because that is the beginning of public cloud platforms. Got no notice at the time, but today it's, well, somewhat more visible, would you say? Yeah. Okay. The third event is probably the single most hyped IT event in the history of mankind. It is the launch of the iPhone. And that mattered so much because the iPhone is what took the world from mobile phones to mobile platforms. Before the iPhone, we had lots of phones we could carry around, but they weren't platforms in the sense of application platforms. At least not to most people's minds. The iPhone, I would argue, is the birth of mobile. It's the real birth of mobile in our world. Now, I'm going to tell you, just a moment, why those three are so important. Before I do, however, notice something else. Notice that not one of those came from Microsoft, or IBM, or HP, or VMware, or any of the classic enterprise vendors. Instead, the IPO, Salesforce, a scrappy San Francisco startup, AWS from an online bookstore, and the iPhone from what was not long before a broken down PC vendor. That's how it always works, isn't it? The kinds of world transforming events, which often aren't visible as such when they occur, tend to come from out of the way places. The big mainstream vendors don't do this stuff generally. It comes from elsewhere. How the world commonly is. Oh, by the way, I hope it's clear to you I don't work for Microsoft. If nothing else, this slide should help make that clear, right? And what you're seeing here is my perspective, right? I don't work for Microsoft, but I hope you find it useful. So why are these three the most important events? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because they are the seeds from which has grown the new default enterprise platform. Look at this. Today, traditionally, the last many years, the classic enterprise IT platforms looked like this. Right? We had PCs and laptops as our clients. Okay, great, PCs and laptops. Then we have our own data centers. All of you, I suspect, work for firms that have data centers, most of you anyway, with infrastructure, servers, and operating systems, and so on. On that infrastructure, what do? You buy and run packaged apps, SharePoint, Dynamics CRM on premises, SAP, pick your favorite. Lots and lots and lots of packaged apps run in your data center on your own infrastructure, which you own, manage, and run. Also, you build custom apps that also run on that same infrastructure. That has been the conventional approach to IT for a long time. You all have that today, do you not? Most of you look familiar? Yeah? So those three events I just told you about, Salesforce IPO, AWS launch, iPhone launch, were so important because they are the things that change this. I would argue going forward, we're seeing a world with an entirely new default enterprise platform. Looks like this. Clients, well, you know this, PCs and laptops, also mobile devices, tablets, phones. You know, people in the media especially have come to talk about this change using the phrase post-PC era. You've heard that? It's the post-PC era? I'm sorry, people. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. The post-PC era? Really? What's this? Oh, it's called a PC. What's on your desktop at work? Oh, it's called a PC or a laptop. Sir, what's that? A laptop. A laptop. This is so dumb. This is not the post-PC era. It is, however, the PC Plus era. A much better appellation, much better name for this is PC Plus era, because that's the reality. PCs aren't going away, nor are laptops. We just have more things to worry about. So, clients look like that. On the server side, things have changed massively. On the server side, what we're seeing is the rise of SaaS applications. What were once on-prem apps are becoming SaaS applications. So all of you, I suspect, when you look for a new packaged application, you at least consider a SaaS option, do you not? If not, you probably should, because that's where the world is going quite clearly. And finally, for custom apps more and more, and in the future more and more, are being built on public cloud platforms. In fact, I would suggest to you that cloud platforms are becoming the new foundation for competitive advantage. And here's why. Might not be obvious. Here's why. It's because if you buy a package, generally, your competitors can buy the same package, right? Buying packages is keeping up with the Joneses, lowering costs, and so on. It is custom apps that differentiate your organization. It is custom apps that support business processes that give you competitive advantage. And as those custom apps more and more and more run on public cloud platforms, that means public cloud platforms are the new foundation for competitive advantage. They are really important. They are really important. The choice you make, public cloud platform, is really important to your business, to your career. So, this, I would argue, is what the new world looks like. I'm not saying that you're all going to take your current apps and move them wholesale to this world. Heck no. That is not how this kind of transformation happens. Rather, what's going to happen here, what is happening, is when you do new things, buy new packages, build new custom apps, more and more and more you build in this world, not the old world. To me, this is very much like the move from mainframes to client server. When it was first happening, the zealots said, oh, unplug your mainframe, move all your apps to PCs and servers. Yeah, right. People didn't do that. They built new stuff on client server. Okay? Same thing here. We're seeing new stuff being built in this new world. It is, therefore, I would argue, the new default. And these three different pieces all have their origins in those three big events I told you earlier. SaaS, cloud platforms, and the advent of mobile. With me so far? Make sense? I'm curious. Who agrees with me with this perspective? Who agrees? Most of you. I got about 2/3 of the hands. Okay, great. Super. So why am I doing this? Well, first of all, I want to paint this large picture. I promised the big picture, right? And I'll come back to this later on, end of the talk, this diagram, for some more discussion. But what we're going to focus on is, of course, public cloud platforms. I want to talk about that space for most of the time we have together this morning. So let's start. I'm not assuming you know much about this space. So I'm going to do some very simple tutorials. They'll be really fast. If you know a lot, bear with me, please. As some of you may well know, cloud platform technologies are becoming, well, huge. There are so many of them. There are more this week than last week. There were more next week. The vendors are shipping these things out so darn fast. It's amazing. I'm going to talk about the mainstream stuff, the things that really matter. And those are compute, which lets you run new apps and maybe run packages, depends on the kind of compute. Data, lets you store, access, analyze information. And then the third bucket is everything else. Identity, machine learning, VPNs, media integration. That's a huge space which I'm going to mostly ignore. Because today, the money, the market demand, is largely in compute and data. In fact, it's largely in the simplest parts of compute and data. So there's all these wonderful, fancy things rolling out all the time, but the truth is, enterprises like you are initially buying bigger into the first two things, compute and data, often in their simplest incarnations. So let's talk about these. Compute. As I'm sure many of you know, there is this split between two approaches to compute. One of them is called infrastructure as a service, IaaS, commonly pronounced IaaS. Well, it's pronounced IaaS by English speakers. Everyone else says EaaS. I'm American, I'm going to say IaaS. You notice this? Americans talk about IaaS and Azure. Everyone else talks about EaaS and Azure. But I'm not sure what's correct here. I don't think there is correct, but nonetheless, I'm an American, so for me it's IaaS and Azure. IaaS is a really simple idea. It means that you go to a portal, that's a fancy name for a website. You go to a website, you say, I want a VM. It's going to be this big, this many cores, this much memory, this much disk. It runs this Windows Server, this Linux, whatever. I want a virtual machine, give it to me. And you get it right then. You pay for it while it's running. When done, you shut it down. So ask for a VM, get it in a few minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes. Use it for a day, an hour, a week. Pay for that time, shut it down. That's IaaS. Simple idea. PaaS, the other alternative, is an acronym for Platform as a Service. And PaaS turns out to be really hard to define because no two vendors view it the same way, it seems. Generally, you can think about PaaS as just application infrastructure provided on top of the raw VM world to help make applications easier to deploy, to run, to build, to manage, whatever. Okay? So the way I think about PaaS often is with IaaS, you say, I want a virtual machine, give me a VM. With PaaS, you don't do that, typically. You say, here's my app, run my app. PaaS provides a platform for your app to run on. Okay? So two simple categories of compute. The truth is, life is more complex than this, and there's lots of varieties of PaaS, and we'll come back to this. PaaS is a messy space. IaaS is not a messy space. Pretty simple and clear. Brief digression here. IaaS is more important than PaaS. Can I ask, who in the room works for Microsoft? Anybody? Oh, a bunch of you. Okay, great. Within Microsoft, there has been this long belief that PaaS is critically super important, that IaaS is a temporary stepping stone. I once believed that. I don't anymore. The reality today is that IaaS is way more important than PaaS in terms of market share, customer demand. And so it's possible, it's even likely, that over time, PaaS is going to be more important, be dominant. But it's a long ways away. It's a long road, I would suggest. And here's why. Here's why PaaS is less important than IaaS today. It's because IaaS addresses so many more scenarios. There's a lot more you can do with IaaS than you can with PaaS. For example, if I want to build a brand new cloud-native app, I can do it on IaaS, I can do it in PaaS, either one. And lots of people would argue that PaaS is much better for this. I mean, come on. If I build a new cloud-native application on IaaS, I got these raw VMs. I have to build on raw VMs and manage those guys and do all this work. If I build on PaaS, I've got this wonderful environment for me that does services, builds things in for me. It's a slam dunk, right? Lots of people think that PaaS is much better for building new apps. And lots of people don't. Because lots of developers say, well, okay, you got these cool services, but I want control. Give me control. I want control. My friend David Platt points this out. He says that in America, most of us drive automatic transmissions, right? Not stick shifts. I can't even drive a stick myself, except for developers who all drive stick shifts because they want control. So it's a concern here that PaaS makes lots of sense, but people feel differently about it. Then, look at this. There are so many other scenarios for which PaaS is not a great fit. If I want to move a website from on-prem to a PaaS platform. Does that work? The answer is it depends. Some PaaS platforms, yes. Others, no. It depends. How about this? If I want to run an on-premise packaged app, like SAP, PaaS is not designed for that. PaaS expects you to build new software. IaaS says, here's a VM, run on my VM. Great, you can do that. To run a standard database like SQL Server, there actually are some PaaS-like technologies that do this. But many of them, most of them, in my experience, do not. They give you separate data systems to work with. Or VMs for dev and test, a very common scenario for using public cloud platforms. That's an IaaS, not a PaaS scenario. Or disaster recovery into the cloud. That's also an IaaS, not a PaaS scenario. This is why IaaS matters more than PaaS today, at least commercially. It addresses a whole bunch more scenarios. If you're interested, tomorrow I'm doing a session that's about how enterprises commonly adopt public cloud platforms. The example is Azure, unsurprisingly. And you're going to see, if you go to that, I'll walk through these scenarios about why they do each one, what it looks like. And they're almost all IaaS scenarios, because that's how people do this. So, IaaS matters a lot today. PaaS is interesting, may have a great future, but today the story is mostly about IaaS. Next, data. The data technology that is in some ways most important today is also the simplest. It's commonly called blobs. It's also referred to as object storage sometimes. I think it's very confusing. Blob is an acronym for binary large object. And so that's what a blob is. It's just big, potentially big chunk of binary data up there in the sky. Blobs are simple, easy to use, and incredibly, incredibly, incredibly cheap. So people use those for various things. There are also, in cloud platforms today, commonly managed services that provide relational data, and there are managed NoSQL services that provide other kinds of data support. You're also free to run both relational and NoSQL DBMSs like MySQL, like Oracle, like Mongo, in IaaS VMs. All right? So, very quick tutorial on basic cloud platform technologies. And I see people taking pictures of my slides. I'm always flattered when you do that. Thank you. I'm glad they're useful. But I will send you the PDF. Right? In fact, Microsoft makes available all the slide decks for Ignite, right? For Ignite. So, yeah. If you are in a hurry, get a card from me and email me, and I'll send you the PDF like tonight. All right. There are whole lots of other technologies, and I mean lots, dozens and dozens of them, in the various cloud platforms. I've chosen only a couple to talk about a little bit. Those couple are identity, which gives you single sign-on in public cloud environments to multiple SaaS applications, and, somewhat oddly, machine learning, just to give you a sense of the range of things that we're seeing in the cloud platform world. I'll talk a bit more about those two guys. I'm going to ignore everything else because the space is just too large. Okay? So with this, here's the grid. I'm going to spend a lot of this session talking about this grid. In this grid, the columns are technologies. Unsurprisingly, they are compute with IaaS and PaaS, data with blobs, relational, and NoSQL. And by the way, lots of folks don't include blobs in data. They say blobs are storage, not data. Okay, I'm happy for them. Great. I'm trying to be simple here, just to call everything data. So just to be aware of that distinction. And finally, the other category, just because I wanted to, I chose to look at identity and machine learning in those two things. So you're going to see this grid over and over. The columns are technologies. The rows are vendor offerings, mostly. So what are we going to look at? No big surprise, Azure. This is Ignite, right? So we'll look at Azure, right? We're going to look at Amazon, because as I showed you earlier, Amazon kicked this whole world off, right? They're very important in this space. We're going to talk about Google Cloud Platform. We're going to talk about OpenStack, which is not a vendor offering, it's an open source project. And we're going to talk about Salesforce, Force.com, which, as you'll see, is somewhat different than the others. Different from the others? Whatever. Now, some of you were thinking, well, David, Yeah, I know, Microsoft and Amazon and Google, yeah, but where's IBM? And where's HP? And where's VMware? Where are my familiar enterprise vendors? Well, we'll talk about them, but only at the end and kind of briefly. And you know why? I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why by telling you the story of the history of cloud platforms, at least in a vendor sense. And I can think of no better way to tell that story than by walking through the Gartner Magic Quadrant for public cloud, actually for cloud IaaS. Because Gartner's been putting out these MQs for, going on 3 years now. And I'm going to walk through what has happened with these MQs to give you a sense of what has transpired in this market and also of why my grid focuses on the vendors that it does. Okay? So, I'm guessing you're all familiar with the MQ structure. If you're not, here's the thing to know. Where you want to be is in the upper right. Where you don't want to be is in the lower left, generally. Okay? A simple discussion. And I want to be clear here again. Believe me, I do not work for Gartner. So I'm using their quadrants, but the comments I make about them are purely my perspective. Right? I'm not a Gartner person. However, I got to say this. The lead author for these documents is a Gartner analyst named Lydia Leon. I've never met Lydia, never spoken to Lydia, but I think I love her because these documents are so good. They are so good. They are, in my opinion, pretty much the best thing published in the cloud space, with the possible exception of the things that I write, but probably not. Probably not, actually, because these are really super. I mean, even if you don't like the way she positions the vendors, just the context and the explanations, the background are just, they're great. So please, read these. They're available for free. You can find them on the internet for free all the time. So I'm not saying pay money to Gartner necessarily. I'm just saying these are really good documents. So, October 2012, almost 3 years ago, this is ancient history. People still spoke Latin and Greek back then, right? That's how fast our world moves, right? This is just the classical era of cloud platforms. Out in front is who? No surprise, Amazon. They're the guys who gave us this market in the first place, as I showed you, started the talk, and so they're the leader. No surprise. Microsoft and Google are not yet offering IaaS. And I'll tell you why a little bit later. But they were somewhat late to get to the IaaS game. And so they aren't in this quadrant yet. But then look at this. In the leaders quadrant, there are a bunch of these like hosters. Savvis and Dimension Data and what? A lot of us who worked in cloud computing when this came out, by which I mean me and my friends, looked at this and said, what? Because who are those guys? I mean, it was very puzzling to have, for me anyway, it's puzzling. Okay, but Gartner has their perspective. Great. So then what happened? A little less than a year later, another quadrant came out. August 2013, Amazon is still in the lead, and I mean in the lead. Almost nobody is left in the leaders quadrant. Now this, to people like me, made a lot more sense. It's like, yeah, that's the world as I see it back then. Microsoft has just begun offering IaaS. They began offering IaaS 2 months before this quadrant closed. Okay? So their initial position is in the visionaries quadrant. Great. Not too bad for 2 months in the market. Not too bad. Google is not yet offering IaaS, so they aren't here. OpenStack. At this point, the most visible OpenStack supporters, I would argue, were Rackspace, one of its creators, and HP. And they're not positioned all that beautifully here in the MQ. Again, the lower left's where you really don't want to be, typically. And look at this. Look at poor IBM, right? Bottom left, you can't get any worse than that, right? So that's the world a little less than 2 years ago, in Gartner's view, which I got to say I think is correct. So now what? This is the most recent MQ. The next one comes out like next week or the week after. I so wish it were out before my talk today. I can't wait to see what they do. But this is the most recent anyway. Amazon is still out in front, no big surprise, right? Microsoft's a leader as well. And that's interesting because they've offered IaaS for just over a year. I mean, actually less than a year at this point. And they're leaders quadrant. That's interesting. That's interesting. Google has also entered the IaaS market by this point, and they are more or less where Microsoft was previously, which is interesting, the visionaries quadrant. And other big enterprise players, where are they? Well, IBM, you can see here, moved from their lower left rock bottom position up to visionary. They bought somebody. They bought SoftLayer. They bought this company. We'll come back to that. So that was interesting. Classic IBM. Okay. And look at VMware, look at HP. They're in the market, but they're still kind of sunk down there in that, they call it the niche players quadrant. Gartner probably hates me for this, but in some MQs, the niche players contains, in my opinion, contains vendors offering a variety of diverse services for smaller markets. Here, what's being offered is pretty straightforward. IaaS, VMs on demand. I just cannot help thinking about that lower left quadrant, not as the niche players quadrant, but as the losers quadrant, right? Because that's what it feels like to me. So you don't want to be there anyway, okay? So what I'm trying to do here is tell you what's happened and also justify the choices for the rows of my table. What I'm emphasizing are the public cloud platform technologies that Gartner and most other people I work with in this space, including me, think are the most important, or at least the most worthy of discussion in a context like this. Could this change? Absolutely. It's a fluid world. But what we're doing this morning is a snapshot of where things stand in the opinion of Gartner and to some degree me. Back to our grid. For IaaS, Microsoft's technology is called virtual machines. Pretty good name. You know? Simple, clear, straightforward. For PaaS, this is kind of messy. They have websites, they have cloud services. Websites is being folded, even as we speak, into this larger app services category, and they're giving us new PaaS technologies announced just recently. The Service Fabric and something else. So this is a moving space, Microsoft is really into PaaS. They like PaaS. So we're doing a variety, not we, they are doing a variety of things in that space. Their blob technology is called blobs, another excellent name, in my opinion. The relational service is called SQL Database. It's a managed relational service. For NoSQL services, managed services, there are a couple. There's more than this, actually. DocDB, a document database, tables, a key value store. If you care about that, I did a talk on Monday that's all about that box, that space right there. And for identity, they've got this thing called Azure Active Directory. And for machine learning, they've got this thing called Azure Machine Learning, Azure ML. I'm going to take a minute here and do quick one-slide overviews of identity and machine learning in this context, because they're interesting and they're worth describing as an example of the breadth of what we're seeing here in the public cloud platform world. So just a moment here on Active Directory, on Azure AD. Here's the idea. I'm guessing that all of you run on-premises Windows Server Active Directory. It's become, let's say, pretty popular, okay? So, you know what it does, I'm guessing. It lets you have single sign-on, other things as well. But it lets your users log in to their on-prem directory and access applications in their domain, their forest, without logging in again. Single sign-on. Users love this because users hate remembering passwords, okay? With Azure AD, the idea is you can connect, an IT admin can connect on-prem Windows Server AD to Azure AD in the cloud. Once you have done this, now, when the user logs in, they can access, of course, other apps in their own on-premises world with no separate login, single sign-on like always. But they can also have single sign-on to cloud applications, SaaS applications, running on Microsoft Azure. Okay? So that's cool. But now, arguably even more interesting, more surprising perhaps, is that Azure AD gives you single sign-on not just to apps running on Azure, but also to SaaS apps running elsewhere. Out of the box, it supports Google Apps and Salesforce and Dropbox and a whole lot more. Here's the thing. Active Directory on premises is a very important infrastructure technology. It gives us single sign-on. People want that. As we move to the world we talked about earlier, the new default platform, as SaaS apps become the norm, users still want single sign-on. Well, what is going to provide the AD of the cloud world? Microsoft very much wants that to be Azure AD. Okay? It does more things as well, but the core story here is that Azure AD lets you have a single sign-on solution for SaaS applications anywhere, potentially. And the goal is, in some ways, to provide in the cloud what Windows Server AD provides on premises. Okay? Next, I want to say a little bit about this relatively new thing called Azure Machine Learning, because it's interesting, and it also is relevant for comparisons with other public cloud platforms. I think machine learning is among the more confusing technologies out there today. And part of the reason is they use this very strange terminology. You create models and you train your models, and it makes it like a circus act. I don't really understand where the technology comes from. But the idea is pretty straightforward. The idea of machine learning, in the Azure sense anyway, and other cloud platforms, is this. You start with raw data. Ideally, lots of raw data. The more, the better. You then work with that data. You apply pre-processing, and Azure ML has all these modules for data pre-processing to help cleanse that data, make it structured and sensible and so on. Once you've got that prepared data, you then look for patterns in the data. So for example, suppose that data is all about transactions, credit card transactions. And for each transaction, I've got the date and time it happened, where the card was issued, where the card was used, how much it was for, or maybe I've got the that day, whatever, right? I've got all this data for each transaction. I'd like to figure out which ones are fraudulent. Well, how do I do that? Well, there might be patterns. There probably are patterns in this data that indicate that if a card is issued in America and used in Moscow, and the user is 20 to 25, and the amount is over $5,000, maybe, I'm making this up, maybe that indicates there's a potential problem here. You can find patterns in the data to indicate probabilities of fraudulence for the transaction. But we can't find them. There's too much data. What can find them is algorithms, statistical algorithms. They call them machine learning algorithms, just learning algorithms. And Azure ML provides a whole bunch of them, to let you look for patterns in the data. Once you've found a pattern you like, it generates this thing called, this isn't quite right, actually it always generates a model. A model is code. A model is code. It's C# code for Azure ML. It's code. And it's code that knows how to apply the pattern recognition that you worked out with your learning algorithm. You do this over and over commonly until you find a model that you like, that does a good job of predicting, say, transaction fraudulence. You then choose that model, you deploy it, and then applications can use it. Apps can call it at runtime. Say, here's my new transaction data. Is this fraudulent? And the model returns a probability of fraudulence, typically. So that's machine learning. From data to, in this context, some code that an app can call. It's about making smarter apps. And in Azure ML, there's algorithms and preprocessing modules and deployment support and an API and this nice graphical tool, ML Studio, that lets you control this from a common place. So there's a very quick survey of machine learning in the context of Azure ML. So let's think about Microsoft as a cloud platform provider. Quick assessment here. Microsoft was slow in offering IaaS. And the reason is they believed with all their corporate heart in PaaS. They were just PaaS down to the ground. It took them many years from the initial announcement of Azure to actually enter the IaaS market. They believed in PaaS. And I got to tell you, I've never worked for Microsoft as an employee. I have no influence here. But back in 2009, in the early days of Azure, I was writing and speaking about Azure, and I was a believer in PaaS. I thought they were right. In no way am I saying I'm smarter than them. Heck no. In new markets, you're almost always wrong. And so Microsoft was just a huge PaaS believer for a long time. But they eventually bowed to reality And now you've seen they went from nowhere to being a leader in the IaaS MQ. So not too bad, not too bad. They've recovered quite quickly from that delay. Microsoft has strong relationships. Witness you, who are all here. That's important to IT leaders, to decision makers, and Microsoft's already in most accounts. These are good things in terms of selling this to an enterprise. Microsoft also has a strong emphasis on hybrid cloud, on saying, you want on-prem, you want cloud, we'll do both. We'll tie them together. Great. So, for me, these are the three most salient facts about Azure today in this context. They were late to IaaS. They've caught up pretty quickly. They've got these big relationships, which is the strongest advantage, I would argue, today in this market. And they have a focus on hybrid clouds, which you'll see is different from their biggest competitors. Their biggest competitors, including, unsurprisingly, Amazon, who got this whole market started. Amazon's IaaS technology is called EC2, Elastic Compute Cloud. Its PaaS technology, this is a bit debatable. It's interesting. I've told you Microsoft is really fond of PaaS. They like PaaS still to this day. Amazon kind of looks at PaaS and says, yeah, okay, you want some PaaS? Here's some PaaS. But they're just so not PaaS focused, which is really interesting, I think, that these two big players have such different perspectives on this. Amazon's PaaS technology, the most visible one at least, is called, ready for this? Elastic Beanstalk. So when I first saw this, I thought, that's an incredibly stupid name. And then I remembered that I, for many years, was fiercely critical of how vendors name their offerings. And then one of them, Microsoft, called my bluff a while ago, and they hired me to help them name something. And within 20 minutes, I promised to never again criticize vendor naming. Because the problem is so hard. All the good names are taken, all the bad names are taken. It's a really hard problem. So let me say, Elastic Beanstalk, great name. I love that name. It's just really hard. So, their blob technology is called S3, Simple Storage Service. Their managed relational service is called RDS. It's not exactly like SQL database, but it's analogous in that it's a managed relational. You aren't running your own database instance, you have to manage yourself. For NoSQL, their big story is DynamoDB, which is kind of a mixture in some ways of DocDB and tables, key value store and document store, kind of. For identity, Amazon's not in that space. I mean, they've got identity for controlling access to their own resources, but they don't have an offering, at the moment at least, that tries to become the Active Directory of the new cloud world, which I think is interesting. It's really interesting. But for machine learning, they announced just last month Amazon Machine Learning. And let me tell you how it's different from Azure Machine Learning. In Azure ML, remember, there was that long chain of things going on. Microsoft provides a bunch of modules for data cleansing and a bunch of algorithms for searching for patterns and so on. Well, Amazon ML is similar, except it's much simpler. They provide a small set of modules working on data, and they provide a grand total of 3 algorithms. And they choose them for you. They choose them for you. So the result is a much simpler service, one that can be used by developers. The Microsoft Azure Machine Learning technology assumes that you have working with you a data scientist, somebody who knows statistics, understands this space. It's more powerful, more flexible, and harder to use. Amazon went for simple, developer-focused, get it out there. Which is going to win? I don't know. I'm interested to see. But the approaches are different in that way, that Microsoft expects a somewhat higher level of ability and gives you more functionality. Amazon targets developers. Less functionality, but simpler to use. All right? Yeah, I'm sorry. I just can't do questions during the talk. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. I don't like with big groups, and they object from Tech Ed, so from Ignite. Afterwards, I've had to talk to you. Forgive me. I'm sorry. Okay, so an assessment of Amazon here. Amazon's an amazing thing because AWS is a startup that got it right immediately. The first things they released back in 2006 were EC2 and S3. Actually, other order, S3 and EC2. Blobs and IaaS. That was the first things they did. And those are still the most important technologies commercially in terms of revenue in this space today. That's so rare, right? Startups are always pivoting, right? They got things wrong, but Amazon got it right out of the box, which is remarkable. They're viewed as a leader in this market, no big surprise, right? They were the first mover, no surprise there at all. A distinction from Microsoft is that Amazon is focused utterly on the public cloud. Amazon's CTO, a charming speaker named Werner Vogels, has talked about private cloud as false cloud. It's false cloud. You know, vendors always promote what they sell, and Amazon sells public cloud only. So that's a big distinction between Microsoft's approach and Amazon's approach. Maybe the biggest in terms of a strategy difference, maybe. Technically, they got a lot of similarities, as you've seen. So Amazon is all about public cloud. And I got to say, thus far, Amazon has larger market share, much of which is startups and ISVs. Startups and ISVs do not care about, in general, about hybrid clouds. They're building new apps on the public cloud. Great. Enterprises, in my experience, care more about hybrid clouds. As we move into the era where public cloud platforms will be adopted by enterprises, we may see this change somewhat. We may see the relative market shares change. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Next, Google. Google has Compute Engine for IaaS, App Engine for PaaS, Cloud Storage for Blobs, Cloud SQL for relational, Cloud Database for NoSQL. Again, they're not in the Azure AD market. They're not competing in that space today. But they have a machine learning technology as well called Prediction API, which is more like Amazon than like Azure. It takes the simple approach. Let's have developers do this. We don't expect them to have these complex data scientist guys around. So that's interesting. Some thoughts about Google here. Google began with App Engine. Like Microsoft, Google believed in PaaS. They believed in PaaS. It took them even longer than Microsoft to offer IaaS. So both of those companies took the PaaS approach originally. It's interesting. Today, I would suggest that Google appears to be serious about cloud platforms. For the longest doggone time, they didn't seem serious. They put out App Engine, it just sat there for years doing nothing. But now they offer IaaS, and this, I think, is a big thing. When they first offered IaaS, they offered only Linux support. They announced Windows support just last year, Windows Server. And for enterprises, without Windows support, you aren't a player, I would suggest. That's interesting. However, you know what they did? They announced support last year for Windows Server 2008 R2. Last year. And I'm thinking, okay, so next they're going to give us support for Windows NT 3.51, maybe. It surprised me. But what they did, they followed up with 2012 support, so R2. So that makes sense, okay? I think they're actually serious, finally. But they're behind. They're behind, technically, they enter the market later than Amazon and Microsoft. So if you're Google and you aren't ahead technically, what can you do? Answer, you could be a price leader. Now, it turns out that being a price leader in this market typically means that you're a price leader for about 10 minutes, or maybe a week if you're lucky. Because when anybody cuts these basic services, IaaS and blobs, others all join. They all follow. If Google cuts, then Amazon and Microsoft join. If Amazon cuts, Microsoft joins. In fact, Microsoft has promised to always at least match Amazon's prices for IaaS and blobs. So being a price leader means you drive prices down, but you're on a big advantage for a long time because others will match your prices. But Google's done some very interesting things here. They have said, for example, that cloud platform prices should follow Moore's Law. Whoa. Whoa. Moore's Law roughly says that things get half as cheap, half as expensive, half the price, every 18 months to 2 years. So if cloud platform prices are dropping by that speed, led by Google, it's going to be really interesting. Google also does things like this. Amazon has long offered discounts for commitment. If you commit to some number of IaaS VMs over a period of time, a year, whatever, give you a price break. No big surprise, right? What Google did is Google said, you know, if you just use all those VMs that period of time, we'll give you a discount, as if you planned ahead. Well, that's interesting. So we're seeing some innovation in pricing with Google. I'm going to come back to these guys because they have real potential to be a real big player in this space. To me, the core question is, do they really want to be? Do the margins in this business offer anything attractive to a company who's used to margins from search, which are better than anything in the world probably, right? Terrifically good. So the big issue for Google, I think, for me at least, has been, do they really want this enterprise platform market? We'll come back to that. Next, OpenStack. If you are an OpenStack fan, prepare to be incensed. So, OpenStack is an open source project. It has a lot of things. I've listed a few of them here. There's a compute, there's object storage, there's database, there's more. There's a lot of stuff, okay? It's not a vendor offering. It's an open source project. And so, some thoughts here on OpenStack. Who in this room, Microsoft guys, don't raise your hand. Among customers, who in this room likes the idea of being locked into a single vendor? You love vendor lock-in. You live for vendor lock-in. Who likes vendor lock-in among customers? I see no hands. Right, okay. The vendors won't raise their hands, but if I ask them, I'd say, which vendors like vendor lock-in? Their hands would all go up, right? Vendors like vendor lock-in. Who typically wins this competition? Answer, users, it ain't you. Sorry. Vendor lock-in is a reality in so many contexts because the vendors want it so much. They want it so much. And so OpenStack, like efforts before it, I can list several, has the story that we're open source. If we support OpenStack, then you're not locked in because we're all a standard. But in fact, OpenStack has a bunch of openings, things left undefined, which every vendor must fill in themselves. So OpenStack lets the vendors that use it tell the standards, no lock-in story, while in fact locking you in. Right? That's the classic approach vendors take in these situations. We've seen it before, many times. And so OpenStack is just not really a standard. Parts of it are, parts of it are not. And further, there are companies that offer public IaaS based on OpenStack, which is our focus here today. There's a whole separate discussion about private cloud IaaS, but our focus is public cloud. My perspective here is that because there are lots of companies involved in OpenStack, in the project, it gets all this press attention. You read about it in the press all the time. At least if you're me, you do. But to me, that attention is way out of proportion with its actual usage. Because right now, there's only a few vendors doing this in a big way. They are HP and Rackspace, okay? The most visible, anyway. Now, HP has this Helion public cloud, not gotten too much traction. Recall where HP was in Gartner's quadrant? Down there in the lower left, where you don't want to be. A few weeks ago, maybe you saw this, an HP cloud executive gave an interview to the New York Times, it appeared in the Times anyway, where he appeared to say things that suggested that HP was leaving the public cloud platform market. Did you see this, anybody? Yeah, there was a bunch of press about it, right? And then they came back and said, no, that's not true, misinterpreted. Okay, fine. But what there wasn't in the reaction to these potential announcements was any surprise. Nobody said, HP's leaving the market, how can that be? Because HP is just not a huge player here at this point. So, and Rackspace, fanatical support. They will no longer sell you raw IaaS. When you get IaaS, you get support. They don't compete price-wise with Amazon, Microsoft, and so on. So I'm skeptical about OpenStack's long-term future. At most, I would suggest we're going to see one or two vendors dominate the space. At most. But aside here, what does it even mean to be a cloud standard? What does it actually mean? Well, there are various things it might mean, but here's a big deal, a big part of what it means in this context. It means this. Your cloud software, your cloud platform, has IaaS, it has blobs, and applications and tools want to use that, which means there's an API. It kind of drives me nuts that the term API has ceased meaning API like to Windows 32, the Win32 API, and now means a RESTful interface, typically. We called those web services previously. Now they're called APIs, so there it is. An API for IaaS and blobs, IaaS will have commands like start a VM, stop a VM. For blobs, there are requests like get a blob, put a blob. RESTful interfaces of some kind, typically. And so there are in the world plenty of cloud platform APIs. Amazon has one, Azure has one, OpenStack defines one. OpenStack would very much like to see its API become a standard. So you as users will be less locked in for tools and management and so on. But if you look at the list of OpenStack supporters, conspicuously absent are Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. So the big players just aren't there because they want to lock you in. They don't want standards. So, color me skeptical about this. All right, one more row in our table. Salesforce. Salesforce has this public cloud platform called Force.com. And the key thing to know about Salesforce in this market, I would suggest, is that Salesforce is playing a different game. They don't offer IaaS. They don't do IaaS. They do PaaS with Force.com. And by the way, I had chosen there to write Force.com AppLogic. AppLogic, I simply made that thing up to say this is the code part of Force.com because there's actually no name for that piece. So don't be confused by that. AppLogic is my name for the code part of that. They also have a NoSQL database, the Force.com database. They actually call it that. And they've got identity as well. So they're in some ways going after the market of Azure AD, in some ways. But the key thing here is that Salesforce is just playing a different game. They are selling Force.com typically, by no means always, but more often than not, as an adjunct to their CRM app. They're doing a cloud platform sale where the app is what drags along the platform. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. And it's PaaS, so in general, PaaS is meant for custom apps, which people build in Force. And the argument they make, I think, is compelling. It is that if you're using CRM, Salesforce CRM, then your customer data is going to be in the cloud. Why wouldn't you build new custom apps that use that data in the cloud where the data is? Makes perfect sense. It's a good argument, and it works. People like it. Also, Force.com is aimed at enterprise developers, and so it has these tools for building apps that are very interesting. You can do point-and-click development, no code, for a number of things. And if you want to, they've got their language called Apex. It's like Java, to actually build applications. So they're very enterprise-focused with ease-of-use tools and so on. Microsoft has this thing called XRM in Dynamics CRM. They're a competitor to Salesforce. XRM is really a good deal like, very analogous to Force.com. Who in the room has ever heard of XRM? Okay, better than I expected. I am mystified about why Microsoft talks so little about XRM, because it's a cool PaaS platform with some great functionality and ease of use. But it gets sort of submerged in many discussions, it seems to me. But it's worth pointing out, Microsoft's got a technology that's analogous to Force.com. So Force is a good story, playing a different game, playing it very well. And there's this thing about Force that's worth pointing out. The customer lock-in is total. If you build an app on Force, you're building in their proprietary database format, proprietary language, Apex, or their tools. The lock-in is total, okay? And there is no lock-in like cloud lock-in. Here's why. If you build, or rather you buy some application from some vendor. You run it on your own data center. You stop upgrading. You stop paying maintenance. Well, the app still works, hopefully, right? I mean, the app is still there to run, okay? In a cloud world, you build an app on a cloud platform, like Force, that locks you in. You stop paying your fees, they will shut your app down. Right? Now, this is some lock-in, right? This is some lock-in. But is Force successful? You bet they are, because when I talk to IT leaders who are using this, what they say to me is, David, I can build useful business apps really quickly, solve my problems, I'm a happy person. I'm good with this. So, it's worth pointing out, but clearly, this lock-in is not a showstopper for people who want to use this. Speaking of PaaS, Gartner has a PaaS MQ, Enterprise Application PaaS. It's focused on enterprises. So look at this. The leader is Salesforce, Force.com. And I would suggest they're the leader because the MQ is so enterprise-focused. Microsoft's a leader as well, a bit behind, because Microsoft's PaaS up to now has been, I would argue, more ISV-focused, harder to use for enterprise. Now that's changing. One of Microsoft's new PaaS offerings is aimed right at enterprise developers. So this is changing, but that's how it's been. Look at Google. That's App Engine. Google was released before Azure, a long time ago. App Engine was released, and it's still a challenger. Really. This is part of why lots of people have wondered how serious Google is in this market, because things don't get much better. They just kind of stay there, which is interesting, at least with App Engine. And the rest of this market is a crowded mess. There's lots of vendors. IBM's in there, you can see, with the thing called Bluemix. But there's lots of small vendors. People can't even agree on what PaaS means. So it's confusing. And this came out a couple months ago. Last year's PaaS MQ looked just like this. I mean, almost identical. Microsoft's moved closer to Salesforce. Salesforce has pulled down a little bit. But it's almost identical in terms of leaders and so on. So it's interesting. I do not envy the Gartner analysts who have to build this MQ, because it's a huge, complex space, as you can see. All right. Let's talk about some of the big guys that I've been ignoring. IBM. What's IBM done here? Well, they began with a number of what felt to me like half-hearted cloud initiatives, and they all just sort of faded away. They got no traction. Users just didn't buy in. IBM killed them. And then, as we saw in the MQ walkthrough earlier, IBM in 2013 bought SoftLayer. SoftLayer was half hoster and half cloud provider, which means that unlike Amazon, Azure, Google, you could get not just VMs, because IaaS is VMs, you could get hardware. You could get an actual server, your own physical box. And so IBM, in their SoftLayer discussions, often talks about this. We can give you VMs and physical servers. Cool, great. But here's the thing about IBM. IBM announced a while ago that they were going to spend this $1 billion on cloud. And people said, whoa, $1 billion on cloud, cool. And then it became clear that they meant this to be spread across like a couple of dozen data centers. And you got to realize that Microsoft or Google, they spend that much to build a single data center. And here you come to the crux of why some number of people, including me, most days, think that IBM is very challenged here. Because the leaders in this market, Microsoft, Amazon, and the potential joiner, I think, Google, all have large amounts of money. Amazon least of all, but still. Lots of people believe that as this market keeps on going, price competition forces down what you can charge, it's going to be up to the big guys who will have the money and the scale to run these massive data centers to be price competitive here. And lots of folks think the long-term survivors, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, because of money primarily. And if you look at this, what's happening here? IBM's overall revenue has been declining steadily for the last couple of years. So how much did they have to put into data centers? And they were very late to this game. Here's a quote from one of their VPs from last spring. I think we've been in cloud at a perfect time. I think only they think this, right? So I got to tell you, I love IBM. They were a client of mine for many years. They're a fine company. I'm a big fan. I'm concerned here. This is part of why I can't wait for the next Gartner MQ. Because will Gartner make them a leader? I'd be surprised. I'd be surprised. But we'll see. We'll see. Okay? VMware. Okay. Who in this room has VMware in your data center? Another question. Who in this room does not have VMware in your data center? Okay? A few of you. Okay, great. So they're important to all of us, right? They've also gone through various strategies. Initially, they said, hosters, you take our vCloud stuff and offer IaaS. But hosters said, I don't think so, because it commoditized them, for one thing, or for the exact same stuff. Then VMware said, okay, we're going to have our own public cloud offerings. It was called vCloud Hybrid Service. It's now called vCloud Air, which I got to tell you is, I think, the coolest name of all of cloud computing. vCloud Air. I love that for a cloud service, Air. I wonder how Apple feels about that. I don't know, right? But I love that. It's a very cool name. They're offering this right now, and it's got some nice features. It lets you connect easily to on-premises because it's the same stuff, both places. Very cool. However, it's not a full cloud platform. It's really IaaS. It's IaaS. They don't offer things like blobs yet. And so what they've done is interesting. They've partnered with Google because Google has all those services that VMware doesn't, and VMware has all those nice enterprise relationships that Google doesn't. So, strong synergy, a match made in heaven, potentially. So we'll see what happens here, but recall where VMware was in the last Gartner MQ. Sunk down the lower left. So, they have some challenges. They also face the same scale issue that maybe IBM does against Microsoft, Google, Amazon, of being able to support these massive automated and thus low-cost data centers. One more MQ. They're fun to look at, I think. Storage. The leader is Amazon, also a leader, but second is Microsoft with Azure. You can see here, Google's a ways behind, and the major enterprise vendors, IBM, HP, not very strong there. So do you see why in my grid I chose the technologies I did for the rows? This is what drove me, was my experience and the world we see around us, of what's happening about important players in this space. So this is kind of interesting. Gartner has 3 Magic Quadrants that are directly about public cloud right now. There's IaaS, there's PaaS, and there's storage, which is blobs to a great extent. It's worth noting that Microsoft is a leader in all 3 of them. It is not the leader in any of them. And now tell me, is this not classic Microsoft strategy? To not be the best any one thing necessarily, but to be a leader across a whole range of things. Can you say SharePoint? Right? I would argue SharePoint was like that initially. It strove not to be the best of any one thing, but to be really, really strong, good enough across a whole bunch of things. And so perhaps we're seeing, I would argue we're seeing, a somewhat similar strategy here. In fact, the way I personally would summarize Microsoft's position in this space is with this picture. 2 dimensions. Number 1, how good are they, how strong are they in the cloud world? Number 2, how strong in the enterprise? And these are somewhat subjective measures, but clearly the big cloud vendors like Google, Amazon, Salesforce, they've got lots of cloud strength, less enterprise strength today. Salesforce, the strongest I would suggest among those. It's debatable, but nonetheless, they're more in the toward the upper left. The lower right, you see the classic enterprise vendors. HP, IBM, VMware, strong in the enterprise, but as we saw from the Gartner discussion and so on, not much enterprise strength. Microsoft's uniqueness here, their strategy, at least from my point of view, in one diagram, is that they are working toward being strong in both. That's the uniqueness about their approach. It's interesting. You know, people criticize Steve Ballmer. I will never criticize Steve Ballmer because Ballmer's the one who made the very risky investments years ago to spend billions on data centers so they could be here today. It was not a stupid choice. All right. In my last 11 minutes, I want to go back to where we started. I want to go back for the final big picture to this diagram. What I'm arguing is the new default platform enterprises going forward. If you break this down a bit more, you see that in the public cloud platform, there's a whole bunch of technologies that we've discussed here at some length, right? IaaS, PaaS, blobs, all that stuff. For SaaS applications, there are lots of things you might discuss. The most important today would certainly include, not limited, but include email, collaboration, productivity, CRM. Those are things that have gone to the cloud fastest. And for clients, of course, we care about PCs and laptops, tablets, and phones. I want to walk through, to end our talk here, a bunch of vendors from this perspective, from how they are positioned, what they're offering in the context of this new default enterprise platform. This is a Microsoft conference, so let's start with Microsoft. Right? Azure is their cloud platform. As we've discussed, they have a bunch of stuff. Right? For SaaS applications, their main store is Office 365 with Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Office Online. They also have CRM Online. And for clients, they have Windows 8, Windows Phone 8 across the various clients. And we know that within a couple of months, they'll have Windows 10 across all of them. Okay? Is anybody ever going to tell us why they skipped Windows 9? I hope so, because I'm just curious, but I don't know the answer. So Microsoft has a story across all of those spaces. I am pretty confident that they'd like to have some more market share down here in that mobile space. Right? I think they would. But nonetheless, they're addressing the three areas. Amazon, as we've seen, has strength in the public cloud platform, offering a range of things. Amazon has, interestingly, just begun doing stuff on the left side. They announced Workmail, a cloud-based enterprise email system, recently. So that's very interesting. On clients, they do have some stuff in the phone and tablet space, Fire Phone, Kindle Fire. Those are arguably more consumer-focused, not enterprise-focused. But I put them here just to be, fairly complete. But those are more consumer-oriented. Google, look at this. As we saw, Google Cloud Platform has a bunch of stuff. They also, as of course you know, have Gmail and Google Docs and a strong story in the SaaS side in some parts of that market. And in the client side, they've got Chrome. They've got this little phone OS you might have heard of called Android. It's got some market share, right? It's amazing to me that Android went from non-existence to the world's most widely used OS in what, 5 years? 6 years? Something like that? It's amazing to me. It's incredible. So Google, in terms of filling in the boxes, has a really strong story here. As I keep on saying, though, the thing that lots of people wonder, like me, is, does Google actually want to be in this business? Because being the enterprise vendor is so different from what they mainline, what they do for the mainline. The margins are lower, requires things like Salesforces and stuff like that. So we'll see. They've built the stuff. They seem to have the offerings. What they're going to do here is interesting. It does seem to me, as I said earlier, that their commitment to public cloud platform has gotten much more serious in the last year. So we'll see what happens. OpenStack, well, it's kind of unfair because OpenStack is really just about one piece and only a subset of one piece of this story. So it's a small example. Salesforce. Salesforce has only pieces of this. Their PaaS-oriented cloud platform, their CRM app, and no real client. Again, don't be confused. I know they've got client pieces for applications and so on. This is a platform discussion. They aren't competing with Android or Windows Phone or anything like that. That's what I mean here. So they've got a unique story, playing a unique game against the others, and doing quite well at it. IBM, well, SoftLayer, they've got IaaS virtual servers. They bought Cloudant, which is a NoSQL directory service. I'm sorry, NoSQL database service. They have Bluemix, which is their PaaS platform. It's interesting. It also runs on premises. Got some links to .NET. It's interesting. But again, they've got a smaller set of things here at this point. They're not in the SaaS application world. They're not in the client world at the platform level. But they do have the deal with Apple, of course, but that's more for applications than the platform level. When I give this talk, afterwards, people always ask me, so where's Apple in this? And the answer is, they're not here. They don't sell a public cloud platform. And that's the centerpiece of this talk. So I don't talk about them here because they're clearly very important to the client, but they're not a public cloud platform player. Hence, they aren't here. VMware, again, a small piece of this, vCloud Air, with IaaS primarily, and then in the other markets, by and large. All right, so we are seeing a really huge change in enterprise platforms. Everything is changing at the same time. Public cloud platforms, the rise of SaaS, the rise of mobile, all at once. This is remarkable. This is really remarkable. And I would suggest to all of you that as you think about embracing this world more and more fully, recognize that you're choosing partners. You might think, well, you know, my developers are just going to do some experiments on some cloud platform here and let them fool around, and that might be a good thing. But recognize that you are choosing partners here, enterprise partners. I was in Bogota, Colombia this spring. I met with the CIO and his direct reports who were addressing this issue, and they had chosen a cloud platform. And I asked them how they chose it, and they said, well, you know, I let my devs choose the platform. So I talked to them. So what did you choose? Why did you choose it? And they said, I chose this because with this guy, this cloud platform, I got new IaaS VMs in 3 minutes. This one took me 5 minutes. Oh, I chose 3 minutes. Okay? Don't do this. Don't do this, right? This is irrational. This is the kind of thing that a developer might value greatly. But for an enterprise choosing a core platform for this brave new world of the future, you want to make much more holistic decisions than that, I would suggest. These are not simple decisions. So I encourage you, take them seriously. This is a big deal. And one last thing. Changes of this magnitude are really rare in our industry. They don't happen very often. But one is happening right now. One of the biggest shifts ever in computing, in enterprise IT. And we are all alive and working in the field right now. Aren't we lucky? It is a great time to be in technology. Thank you very much.